In 1720, a major inflation peak. In 1825, another one. In 1929, the cycle repeated. The interval, 103 years. If this pattern holds, the next major peak may arrive in 2033 to 2034. To understand the global stock market, you must look far beyond its borders. In reality, Taiwan is the heart of the global semiconductor industry. It is a global mirror of NVIDIA, TSMC, and the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index. By understanding TAIEX, you gain the power to see through the future of all technology stocks. I am a traveler from the year 2084. Today, using TAIEX as my lens and the 300-year historical chart as my witness, I will reveal the hidden secrets of the century-long cycle. If you want to know when the Great Depression of 1929 will repeat itself, you only need to understand one thing: the Wah-Zai Centennial supercycle. In that single moment of realization, you will decode the DNA of a market crash and foresee exactly when the next catastrophe will strike. If you wake up tomorrow, and your savings are still there, but the bank won't let you withdraw, and 3 months later the company begins layoffs, and 6 months later housing prices collapse, and you can't pay the mortgage, but no buyer is willing to take it over, you can only watch helplessly as your assets evaporate in your hands. This is not a movie plot. This is a true portrayal of the 1929 Great Depression. History never moves in a straight line. It moves in larger cycles, constantly returning to the same critical point. Approximately every century, the financial system undergoes a total reset. And now, we are standing at the entrance of the fourth 100-year supercycle. In 2015, I first issued a warning. When global bonds and housing markets reverse simultaneously, massive capital will be forced into the stock market. This trend is unfolding today. In 2020, I warned that the Chinese housing market would enter a down cycle. And today, the winter has arrived. By the end of September 2024, I pointed out signals of the Taiwan housing market peaking. The market weakened immediately. If you think such a crisis won't happen in developed countries, please remember that in 2023, bank failure still occurred instantly in the United States. The entire system is more fragile than most people imagine. The real question is not whether the crisis will come, but when it does, which side will you be on? Next, what we need to see is, in the darkest era, who survived. In the catastrophe of the American Great Depression, only a very few not only survived, but became wealthier. One of them was named Floyd Baldwin. On October 24, 1929, on a high scaffolding over Wall Street, a surveyor was looking down to check newly completed data. Suddenly, he noticed something unusual in the streets below. Bankers were rushing out of offices, talking urgently on the streets, looking nervous. The rumor circulating was that, just moments ago, 13 speculative traders had committed suicide. However, this was only a rumor. Regardless of how the media sensationalized it, historical records show that on October 24, 1929, and in the following month or two, there was no legendary wave of wealthy men jumping off buildings. But indeed, shocking tragedies did occur. Chicago real estate investor C. Floyd Thorne ended his life with gas in his kitchen. Kansas insurer John Switchball shot himself twice in the chest. Aside from that, the vast majority of the wealthy chose to live and face the collapse of asset prices. In contrast, the middle class was not so fortunate, as liquidity across the entire nation rapidly dried up. Companies began large-scale layoffs and financial tightening. In a short time, large numbers of the middle class fell into poverty. One moment, they were doctors, teachers, and researchers. The next moment, they became unemployed and unable to afford family expenses. Even with university degrees and impressive resumes, a job could not be guaranteed. The few upper middle class people who kept their positions also saw their incomes nearly cut in half. People started mending old clothes at home, no longer caring about going out in old attire, because almost everyone was in the same situation. When the depression arrives, a new set of life rules quietly takes effect. In 1932, 3 years after the stock market crash, nearly 30 million Americans lost their source of income. Some were unemployed themselves, while some families lost their sole economic pillar. By 1933, the national unemployment rate climbed to 25%. 1 out of every 4 people on the street was unemployed. Ohio lawyer Benjamin Ross wrote in his diary that in the late 1920s, real estate was as seriously overvalued as stocks. Many people had their homes repossessed by banks due to the inability to repay loans. Even if not repossessed, they remained unsold due to a lack of buyers, eventually piling up in the hands of banks. At the same time, large numbers of people withdrew bank deposits as cash, which directly triggered the subsequent wave of bank failures. Between 1931 and 1932, news of bank failures went from shocking to commonplace. According to the diary of Northern Iowa resident Claire Appleman, on December 14, 1932, of the 8 banks in her town, only 3 remained in business. 5 months later, all 8 banks had collapsed. Statistics show that, during the Great Depression, nearly 10,000 banks collapsed across the U.S., with depositors losing as much as $2 billion. To save on expenses, people began growing their own vegetables and rolling their own cigarettes. Once sophisticated dining tables became simple pots of stew, churches began providing free meals. People returned to imitating the lifestyle of the late 19th century. Bicycles once again became the primary mode of transportation. Large numbers of unemployed turned to agriculture for a living. But agriculture was also in trouble. During World War I, farmers expanded cultivation areas and equipment investment to meet war demands. After the war ended, demand shrank rapidly. Many people thus carried heavy debts secured by land. They could neither sell agricultural products nor repay loans. According to Claire Appleman's diary, in the early days of the Great Depression, people still held hope, expecting the government could turn the situation around. However, by 1933, agricultural prices continued to fall. Whether selling pigs or corn, eggs, or dairy products, the income was not even enough to cover the most basic living expenses. When winter arrived, the Appleman family could not even afford money to buy coal, relying only on burning wood and corn cob for warmth. The wheel of fate seemed determined to completely crush the lives of 1930s farmers. In July 1933, Claire, who hadn't written for 2 months, finally wrote down the reason in her diary. A severe drought swept across, and the hard-cultivated crops almost all withered. "My heart is about to break," she wrote. At that time, she could not have predicted that this deadly drought would start from that year and continue until 1940. This is exactly the famous Black Storm in American history, the Dust Bowl, which is also the background for Nobel laureate John Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. The Dust Bowl caused massive numbers of Midwestern farmers to lose their homes and source of income. At the same time, those unable to repay loans or pay rent were also forced to leave their dwellings. Some relied on relatives to barely survive. Some begged landlords for rent extensions. Still others fell directly into the streets, becoming homeless drifters. When society falls into despair, the market is completing another cycle. By 1932, millions of Americans had lost fixed residences. Shortage of funds forced society back to the most primitive forms of exchange. People used their only labor and output to exchange for vegetables, chicken, and dairy products as basic living necessities. In difficult times, people often urgently seek spiritual sustenance. During the Great Depression, this sustenance was reflected in both lotteries and religion. The lottery industry saw an unexpected recovery, with long lines to beg for money. Churches also welcomed large numbers of believers again. In September 1929, there were about 1,600 churches and over 90,000 active believers across the United States. By 1944, the number of churches increased to over 5,600, with believers exceeding 120,000. Economic pressure also changed family structures. Between 1929 and 1939, the number of single women increased by about 22%. Even married women faced the risk of family breakdown due to husband's unemployment. Some men chose to leave home, while families that stayed together often gave up on childbearing plans due to worries about high upbringing costs. Under the shadow of economic collapse, Entire societal values and lifestyles were quietly reorganizing. In 1936, U.S. fertility rates dropped to their historical lowest point at that time. Economic pressure made countless families unable to afford education expenses. Many teenagers were forced to drop out and leave home. They often set out on drifting paths by hopping on trains. That is an apparently romantic image in movies, but in reality, it was full of danger and uncertainty. In 1997, when writer Errol Lincoln Lewis found those runaway youth from back then, they had already become elders in their 70s and 80s. Recalling the years of drifting in the Great Depression era, their tone carried both nostalgia and a faint sorrow. People always like to look for legends in a crisis, but rarely believe that in a catastrophe of the Great Depression level, there are still people who can rise against the trend. But history never only leaves behind victims. Floyd Odlum, he was called by later generations as one of the few investors who successfully achieved wealth during the Great Depression. Odlum came from a humble background. In 1924, he and friends pooled $40,000 to start investing. By 1929, he had accumulated about $1 million in assets. However, in the summer of 1929, he perceived danger signals behind the excessive prosperity of Wall Street, thus selling half of his holdings before the stock market crash, and actively retaining cash. As the darkest moment of the Great Depression neared its end, when the market hit bottom in 1932, he used the liquidity in his hands to acquire quality assets forced into sell-offs at prices close to 50% off original value. Only a year later, by 1933, Odlum ranked among the wealthiest investors in the U.S. When the Great Depression took away jobs from a quarter of Americans, women instead became one of the few relatively benefiting groups. From the 1930s to the 1940s, the number of employed women increased by about 24%. Since many were engaged in domestic services, nursing, and education, these job demands were relatively stable, allowing many to secure livelihoods amidst the wave of unemployment. Today's world, though different from the 1930s, still warrants high alertness toward the link between the Chinese Depression and international relations. The question truly worth pondering is not whether history will repeat itself, but establishing effective systems and cooperation mechanisms to reduce the risk of misjudgment and avoid conflict escalation. Peace is never accidental, but the result of consistently choosing rationality and cooperation. The Great Depression was both cruel and ruthless, but history never only leaves behind losers. Those who survived extreme crises often possessed the traits, a professional ability clearly superior to others, and the investment wisdom of maintaining patience, discipline, and cash surplus amidst turmoil. When the world shakes violently, what truly protects you is not the ability to predict markets, but preparation and self-restraint. In the 1929 stock market crash, even the Rockefeller family experienced a shrinkage of nearly 90% in assets. This reminds us that in the face of a century-level crisis, existing wealth and status could all be reshuffled. What can truly traverse cycles are those who understand patterns and position themselves ahead of time. History won't simply repeat itself, but it always rhymes. When the next cycle arrives, the few who are prepared will see opportunity, while most only see the storm. The question is never whether the storm appears, but when it comes. Do you want to be the person who sees opportunity, or the person who can only passively cross the storm? Finally, a word on why I study these cycles so deeply. Some call me a researcher. Others know me as the traveler from 2084, originally from Taiwan. I'm here not to change history, but to help the wise survive it. The 300-year reset is here. Are you ready?